COVID-19 is here, so to protect ourselves and each other, we all need to stay at home.
A reminder. Yes, that is what it really is. A reminder. A reminder of a constant presence that you cannot change. It is within, constantly within, part of the universal gay DNA. It's similar and akin to grief. Grief is not generally spoken about because there's little point. There's nothing like it. So unless you found yourself within it, you will not understand. That's why words of sympathy may mean more from those who know what it is to lose a parent, a child, or a loved one, rather than the luckier ones who can only imagine what loss is like. It is still kind, however, to acknowledge it though, to sympathize. You're lucky not to know. But grief is not just about death, truthfully. It is found in death because that too is a loss. Grief is about loss. It's an absence. Something, ironically, by not being there, means that it's everywhere at times. It engulfs you. A reminder of the loss and of the grief that arises from loss. It is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. That could be completely true. Except it doesn't acknowledge that never having loved or having been loved is an equivalent loss. Is it not worse that that phrase never acknowledges the absence of love in the first place? Is that not worse? I think ignoring things is an ultimate cruelty. I am here or I am not, but don't ignore my presence. Loss is always present. No need to remind me. I know that. That's why the song in Les Mis resonates so much. There's a grief that can't be spoken. There's a pain goes on and on. Empty chairs at empty tables. Isolation means so many meals alone. Empty chairs at empty tables. How many times have I eaten alone, virus or not? My father liked mince pies. When my mother, who was a great, great baker, passed away, I took up making him mince pies, though I didn't like them myself. I didn't want him to be without. It's also because of him I made my first Christmas cake and pudding from recipes in my Grandaunt May's old recipe book. She was born in 1900 and baked on a range. So to adjust the cooking times to a modern fan oven a century later is tricky and not always successful. Patience. I often need to be reminded of that. I also didn't like the density of the taste of mincemeat. It's called meat, but it's all fruit. I add in a couple of scoops of my homemade crabapple jelly into the mince, and it really is good. Try it. I made the crabapple jelly from the fruit in my garden and in my great-grandmother's 120-year-old copper preserve pan. She, amongst many things, had a bakery and was a jam maker. Like many on my father's side, I was surrounded by good food. A pleasant reminder. Mincemeat not only reminded me of my father, but of the lingering grief of his passing. I remember being in a supermarket one day, 2 years later, midsummer, turning into a side aisle and suddenly swerving the trolley wide right to avoid something shocking. They had jars of mincemeat on sale in the summer. It rattled me. I shook. When grief is at its best, it loves to give you a good kick, right out of the blue, exerting maximum impact because you least expect it. It was only a jar of mincemeat. I don't buy it anymore. I don't need to buy it anymore. I remind myself of that. Grief cannot healthily be buried. Grief should not be appeased just by sympathy. Face it, so do not feel sorry for me. Fear of grief places it in a stronger position, because when I'm weakened, it will attack again. Is that unfair to accuse grief of attack? No. It expertly sneaks up on you when you least expect it. Be on your guard, always. After all, it's just sending you a reminder that you are capable of feeling loss, therefore capable of loving and missing it. And that's a good thing. Grief needs to be recognised and acknowledged, and in that way, you will cope. I remind myself daily that I do cope. I win when I cope. A pandemic changes the world. It changed us all in 2020. We must do things differently, they say. But is it really so different? The greatest curse of this pandemic for me, an older gay man, is that once again, grief raised its gnarled finger and tapped on my head saying, I'm still here. Worse still, it reminded me that it'll never be done with me. I know that. Did I really need reminding when I'd already learned to cope? Don't get me wrong. I had dealt with the loss of my parents, my friends, though the absence of their comforting words during a time of isolation was palpable. However, I rationalised it and I could move again. I was glad my parents weren't going through that COVID fear and isolation in their old age. Many of my friends said similar things about their own parents who had passed. That's the rationalisation of grief, and that's positive. I'm also reminded by this virus of the inequality of my circumstances. The never-ending legacy of having been criminalised in my youth and unmarriable in my middle age was haunting me yet again. There is no rest. I don't appreciate this virus for its post-it reminder of my other grief. I salute all the good acts, ads and advice. They save lives. I too coped with the shortages of loo roll, bread, eggs, soap, flour. Baking is back, oh ancestors. And the latest, no dog poo bags. Everyone's walking their dogs more. Poor Bailey better get used to doing it on the trees and the claymore until supplies return. It's no joke having to make do with westerns on TG Car. And now I'm addicted to Dr. Pimple Popper. Television, despite its choice, is worse than ever. All the heartwarming radio and online stories of intergenerational familial love and absence were moving, but another reminder. These generations, now feeling the stress of isolation in their own lives for the first time, didn't bat an eyelid when imposing such long-term isolation by law on LGBT people of my generations. People are finding these isolation weeks tough. Can you imagine how tough the life sentence of isolation from criminalisation was compared to the temporary isolation today? You didn't give a damn back then. Karma, it comes back to bite you. But for you, it was reassuringly temporary. Yippee. For me, it's a constant. And now a virus acts as another reminder. I didn't need either. It's a reminder that you were alone, have no partner or grandkids because it was illegal when you should or could. You'll never have them now, regardless of COVID. Grief for the absence, which is the loss. Loss is grief. Everyone was so comfortable back then. I remind you, yes, comfortable with the insistence that LGBT people be confined to the margins of society or even prison. What's now being missed by so many today was required and insisted upon for us up to 1993. It was necessary then so that we Irish could consider ourselves to be a moral people. That self-isolation doesn't last some weeks. That lasts a lifetime. That apparently is morality. A virus has no morality. People should. Many do. No, there is no partner to cocoon with, to cut your hair, to play Scrabble with, to complain about the TV, or to block the footpath with, for the single people to be forced out on the streets while you couples insist on holding hands when out for a walk and block the way. Another reminder. There are no postcards or family Zooms to keep you going. Many criminalised LGBT were offloaded by their families long ago, who thought more of what the neighbours might say than their own sons, daughters or siblings' well-being. Those relationships aren't always recovered today. The isolation wasn't erased when we finally voted for consent to marriage equality in 2015. Everyone remembers the hurt of betrayal and rejection. The lesson is, if you are to trust again, trust slowly, very slowly. I need no reminding of that. Who do I trust? A second virus? As a young gay man, I learned to cope with my isolated lot by training myself not to hope. I cannot hope then lawfully for a partner, children, in-laws, grandchildren, all the normal things I wanted that are necessarily supporting people in isolation today. My society imposed isolation on me then, and I need no reminding of what pops up in the daily COVID advice on air and in social media. It cuts twice for the present virus and the past criminalisation. Deal with that too. Are we the only ones who have been guaranteed isolation in 2020 and every year up to this and beyond? My closeted gay friends who conform to the heterosexual norm to keep their place in society then, and married and had kids, are being rewarded again now for their inability to acknowledge themselves then and for their willingness to deceive their opposite sex spouse. But don't worry, it was all approved of in that more unforgiving Ireland up to 1993. It was our respectability that mattered. I remind you of our more moral Ireland. Was it then, or is it now? I don't miss it. I could never require others to pay that price on my behalf. I didn't marry the lovely women I knew. Instead, I trained myself to isolate, to dodge the questions, and of course, I reminded myself all the time not to hope. I've been doing it not for a few weeks like you, but for decades. I remind you, you and yours insisted upon that. Remember? People are going crazy not going out at weekends. As I got older, I got used to that too. I wasn't always included when my married friends socialised. I mean, what do you do with the single person at a dinner table for couples who will arrive, converse and leave together? From my perspective, I was reminded that it's hard to leave a crowd alone in the early hours on a Sunday morning. But some couples would kindly offer to share a cab. My house was on their way home. They reminded me it was no trouble. I got too old and probably undesirable for gay socialising being over 40, and it became too loud anyway. I didn't fight for the right to form a relationship, to have it replaced by a relationship with a drug, rather than the handsome man popping that pill with you. I didn't need to go out to expensive nightclubs to be ignored in an eternal younger person's environment. Why don't you socialise with your own age, they wondered. Simple. Pick your answer. 1, some of my generation are lucky and already partnered up and are happy together somewhere far away from the gay scene. 2, they emigrated because they couldn't stand the criminalisation and discrimination here or were thrown out by their families. 3, they died of suicide or AIDS, the forgotten pandemic that killed so much more. 35 million more. COVID is a novice. Did we close down for that pandemic? No. We gays were forcibly self-isolated. Who cared? We learned the danger of a hug or kiss and the safety of a mask, gloves and gown decades ago. COVID is just a repeat, but this time it is shared and understood by more, many more. I'm reminded by this virus that as it was mainly LGBT people who got AIDS, or the poor, who really cared? AIDS was cleaning up Sodom after all. God's will. Is it the same God today, I wonder? 35 million deaths. our Holocaust. And the world, as it does for Holocausts, not only stood by, but many governments and all religions deliberately did nothing. They made their moral choice. You can see that legacy attitude emerging in some of the right-wing responses to the COVID virus. But at least the people know more today and can make informed personal decisions. We young people knew nothing about viruses or same-sex attraction when AIDS hit the Irish in the 1980s. When governments found out about AIDS, many still told us nothing because it would have confirmed our existence, and that could not be because we were criminalised. But we had our frontline heroes too. The few who volunteered, nursed, fundraised, and made a lot of noise until the minimum was done, and I like to be reminded of them. Real heroes tackle a cowardly, invisible virus. I'm reminded that the LGBT commercialised scene is still exploiting by promoting a depersonalising drug culture and encouragement of excess. As a survivor of an older version, I see no place in that for me today. As for the overpriced, loud nightclubs, there's not a lot to do alone, especially alone in a crowd. Do I miss my weekends because of age isolation, like so many others now complain? No. I often bring a book to my local on a Saturday night and read in the corner. I miss the pint though. Weekends are usually my night in as I get older. At least that was good training for the current pandemic. I was reminded that I was used to it. I'm grateful to a handful of younger gay friends who check in on me. I've always said gay people are descendants by culture of the older generations who fought for our rights. That check-in is kind, but confirming that they do see me as old. If I do respond that I'm finding it tough, I invariably get that most unintentionally cruel but common piece of advice. Look after yourself. I already know that is my only option. I don't need reminding of that. I try it every day. A child would probably call a parent in response to that expression of need, but not a younger gay friend who, as a result of our fight, hopefully has that partner now, has always been included in extended family, and may even have a child or two to share isolation with. Times have changed. I'm reminded we won that. We did. I'm glad. Stay calm. It is only a virus. Us gays know all about a virus. There are so many willing people, governments, faith communities, public servants, etc., all now fiercely fighting the COVID pandemic on our behalf, and I salute them. Thank you. It is unparalleled, they say. It is because nothing shut down and help didn't happen during the AIDS Holocaust that wiped out my LGBT generation. But help is happening effectively now, and I don't need reminding to say thank you. I wish I could have said it and meant it decades ago. History's hard lesson is always that little bit more worthwhile when you can see people changing and learning. Though I'm not convinced that if another AIDS came along just for us, the reaction would be much different than in the 1980s. The blessing of COVID is that it doesn't discriminate. Hence, everyone takes notice and is noticed. AIDS didn't discriminate either. It just concentrated. Like COVID did first, on the elderly. Does that remind you now? COVID-19 has reminded me. It's reminded me of things I didn't need any prompting to recall, because they're always lurking beneath the surface of any older LGBT person's mind. Well, those are my generation anyway. Then Connor, a man around my own age, reached out on Facebook. I hardly know him, but he began to send me messages and raise the subject of HIV. I listened. Soon he confided that he was to be tested for lung cancer. Lung cancer in the time of COVID. Rough. After a tense week, he got the all clear. I messaged my congratulations. He replied, I so appreciated how everyone stuck by for those 6 or so hours. I hadn't told the family that they noticed the shadow back on the 20th of September and stayed at the lake waiting for the consultant to call me when he got the time to read the x-ray. Strangely, I wasn't worried about the results. It's the feeling of massive sense of vulnerability. If it were cancer, that would make it 21 comorbidities with me AIDS. Connor had had his 21st reminder. He will live to fight another day because fight he must. We are all fighters. We learned that from our first pandemic. When news of this COVID struck, I found some unused pairs of pajamas in the hot press and washed and ironed them. Like an expectant mother, I got a case ready if I got ill, because there's no one to do that for me. Who will make the call if I get ill? Will I get to the hospital? Who could visit? And if I recover, who will care for me on discharge? That certain legacy needs no reminder. Some of my generation already went through all that, though unlike COVID, that diagnosis then was certain death. But I'm reminded there are things I must do for myself because of who I am and because of what I know happened during the AIDS pandemic. It's like the social distancing required then never ended. There are certain things that won't pass, things we have or had a choice in, unlike the virus. Yearning for a return to the way things were. Really? A return to normal includes that time when we didn't care enough, when generations of LGBT+ were criminalised and died in a global pandemic, and who remain self-isolated and compulsorily socially distanced to this day because we didn't care enough. Do we care enough now? Is there anyone to remind of that? This is also a reminder that as I get older, that legacy of criminalisation and isolation remains my lot on this earth. I remember that every day. I'm socially distanced permanently. It presents constant and new challenges. Grief is one of them. The reminder of the loss of my generations. Grief for the absence of freedom to be. There'll never be a vaccine against all that. There never will or can be. Too much time has passed. This virus is tough enough without being reminded daily of the life prescribed for me by the same society that sounds so concerned today. We are finally in this together. Really? No household visits for the compulsory single, but play away GAA? I'm surviving the shock of the reminder that came with COVID. The grief and loss of what was and what will never be. There'll be no vaccine for that either. We're not all experiencing the same response today because we weren't allowed to be the same then. COVID-19 is different. We are different. We are responding differently than 40 years ago, when I was young and full of hope and the entitled expectation of youth. I witnessed that absence of response and care then. Don't forget that. Remind yourself that was normal. That's who the authors and ancestors of "we are all in this together" were. We were never allowed to be in this or that together then. We were isolated. This isolation reminds me of that. A virus will pass. There will be treatment, a vaccine to suppress it, and maybe even a cure. I'm sure of it. You will survive isolation. I remind you that we gays have done it before and we will do it again, but this time with you and yours. I remind you again of all of that. Stay safe. Welcome aboard.